She didn't know about the trillion-dollar trust fund that had just been transferred into her name, but he knew exactly what he was doing when he walked out the door. The newborn in her arms hadn't stopped crying for 3 hours, but the formula was gone, the heat had been shut off, and the snow outside was falling so thick she could barely see the street through the frosted window. He had left her, not just emotionally, but physically abandoned them both in a ground-floor apartment with no money, no family, and winter closing in like a fist. She was starving, the baby was starving, but the lawyers who had been trying to reach her couldn't get through because he'd canceled her phone 2 days before he disappeared. What she did in the 72 hours that followed would transform her from a desperate mother on the edge of death into something he never anticipated. But by the time he came crawling back, begging on his knees with tears streaming down his face, it was far too late. Had he known what was waiting in her bloodline? Had he calculated that leaving her at her lowest point would somehow benefit him later? And when the truth finally reached her, when she discovered the inheritance that had been hers all along, would mercy be possible, or would the snow that nearly killed her become the cold justice he truly deserved? The apartment was so cold that morning that Emma Thorne could see her breath hanging in the air like small ghosts, but the baby bundled against her chest was warm, and that was all that mattered in the moment. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but the hunger pangs had dulled into a distant ache that felt more like a memory than a physical sensation. The snow had been falling since midnight, but the window was drafty, and ice had begun forming on the inside of the glass in delicate, cruel patterns. Tyler had left 3 days ago, but the space he'd occupied in her life still felt raw, like a wound that wouldn't close. He'd taken everything, not just his clothes and his laptop, but the debit card, the checkbook, the spare cash she'd hidden in the coffee tin. But he'd missed the wedding ring she'd already pawned the week before to buy diapers. The formula was gone now too, but she'd been trying to nurse little Ava, with breasts that produced barely anything because her own body was consuming itself for lack of food. Emma had been beautiful once, tall and graceful with honey-colored hair and gray-green eyes that Tyler had said reminded him of the Pacific, but 3 days of starvation and stress had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles beneath those eyes. She'd met Tyler at a corporate event 2 years ago, but their whirlwind romance had hidden the truth about who he really was. He'd been charming and attentive, but the mask had begun slipping the moment she got pregnant. He'd been supportive in public, but behind closed doors he'd grown cold, calculating, distant. The night Ava was born, Emma had thought she'd seen tears in his eyes, but looking back now, she wondered if that had been the reflection of the hospital lights. He'd held the baby for exactly 4 minutes, but his hands had been stiff, awkward, and when the nurse tried to show him how to support Ava's head properly, he'd handed her back with an excuse about needing to make a work call. The phone on the kitchen counter had been disconnected, but Emma didn't know that yet when she tried to call her mother's old number, a number that had been out of service for 7 years, ever since the car accident that had taken both her parents on a rainy November evening. She'd been 21 then, but grief had made her older overnight. She'd had no siblings, but her parents had been her entire world, and losing them had set her adrift in ways she still didn't fully understand. Tyler had seemed like salvation when she met him, but salvation, she now understood, could wear the mask of damnation if you weren't careful. Ava whimpered against her chest, but Emma had nothing to give her except the soft humming of a lullaby her own mother used to sing. The melody was sad, but it was also a connection to something permanent, something that transcended the cold and hunger and fear. The radiator in the corner hadn't worked in 4 days, but the landlord had stopped returning her calls weeks ago when Tyler stopped paying rent. What Emma didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know because the lawyer's letters had been intercepted, their calls blocked, Their emails filtered into a spam folder by the same man who'd abandoned her. Was that her maternal grandfather, a man she'd never met and whose existence she'd only learned about in fragments from her mother's carefully guarded stories, had died 6 weeks earlier in Singapore? Gordon Whitfield had been a titan of international finance, but he'd also been a man of profound regret. He'd disowned his daughter, Emma's mother, Catherine, when she'd married a middle-class accountant instead of the oil heir Gordon had selected for her. But that regret had grown like a cancer over the decades. Catherine had never told Emma the full story, but she'd mentioned once, in a wine-softened moment, that her father had been a man who valued control above love, power above family. Gordon had spent his final years trying to locate his daughter, but by the time his private investigators found the truth that Catherine had died 7 years earlier, his own health was failing. The trust fund he'd established had been meant for Catherine, but the terms were ironclad. If Catherine predeceased him, everything would pass to her children. Emma had been the sole heir to a fortune that numbered in the trillions when assets, holdings, companies, and investments were calculated, but the notification process was complex, deliberate, and required in-person verification. The law firm handling the estate, Rothman, Silverman and Associates, based in Manhattan, had sent 3 courier packages, but Tyler had intercepted all of them. He'd signed for them with a forged signature, but his handwriting was too angular, too masculine to match Emma's flowing script. He'd opened the letters in private, but what he'd read had changed everything about his calculations. Tyler Bradford wasn't just a financial analyst at a mid-tier investment firm, but he was also a man who'd built his entire identity around the appearance of wealth he didn't actually possess. His apartment before meeting Emma had been rented furniture in a luxury building, but the credit cards funding his lifestyle were maxed out and hidden behind a network of balance transfers and minimum payments. He'd seen Emma as a project, but more than that, he'd seen her as someone vulnerable, someone without family, someone he could control. When he'd opened that first letter and seen the words $1 trillion trust fund, his first emotion hadn't been joy, but rage. Rage that this woman he'd manipulated, this woman he'd isolated and controlled, was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet, but rage most of all that he'd already married her, which meant divorce proceedings would entitle him to exactly nothing if she inherited before they'd been married for the minimum 10 years required by New York's complex equitable distribution laws. The calculation had been simple in his mind. Leave before she finds out, but make sure she's desperate enough that when he returns later, after establishing a pattern of support and care through carefully documented gifts and communication, he can reconcile and position himself for long-term access to the money. He'd been wrong about many things, but his greatest miscalculation was underestimating the woman he'd left behind. Emma stood from the worn couch, but her legs trembled with weakness as she carried Ava to the window. The snow was beautiful in its way, but it was also deadly, and she could see the drifts building against the building's entrance. The superintendent had stopped shoveling 2 days ago, but Emma suspected he'd been told by someone that the apartment's occupants were leaving soon anyway. She needed food, but more than that, Ava needed formula. The baby was 5 weeks old, but she'd already lost weight, and Emma could see the fragility in her tiny wrists, the way her skin seemed almost translucent in the gray morning light. Desperation was a physical thing now, but it sharpened rather than dulled Emma's thinking. In her previous life, before Tyler, before pregnancy, before the systematic isolation, Emma had worked as a freelance graphic designer, but she'd been good at it, talented enough to command high rates from corporate clients. Tyler had convinced her to stop taking contracts 6 months into her pregnancy, but he'd framed it as concern for her health rather than what it actually was, another layer of control. But Emma still had her laptop, though Tyler had assumed it was worthless when he'd left it behind, and she still had the password to her old professional portfolio site. The apartment building had Wi-Fi included in the rent, but it was slow and unreliable. She set Ava down in the bassinet, a second-hand purchase from a thrift store that was one of the few baby items Tyler hadn't convinced her was unnecessary. But she made sure to pile every blanket she owned around the tiny body. Emma's hands shook as she opened the laptop, but muscle memory guided her fingers to the keyboard. Her portfolio site was still active, but the contact form had been disabled. She reactivated it, but she also did something else. She posted a message on every freelance job board she could access, offering rush design services at a fraction of her usual rate. The responses came slowly at first, but within 2 hours she had 3 small jobs: a logo revision, a social media banner set, and a menu design for a local restaurant. The total payment would be $340, but it would take at least 3 days for the transfers to clear. Ava needed food before then, but Emma was out of options except one. She bundled the baby in every piece of warm clothing she could layer, but even then, Ava looked impossibly small. Emma put on her own winter coat, a thin thing that Tyler had always mocked as looking like it came from a garage sale, which it had, but she wrapped a scarf around her neck and pulled on boots that had holes in the soles. The walk to the church, 6 blocks away, took 40 minutes instead of 10 because Emma had to stop every few yards to catch her breath. But she kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. The snow was knee-deep in places, but she waded through it with Ava clutched to her chest like a talisman. St. Michael's Community Church was a modest brick building wedged between a laundromat and a bodega, but the lights inside were warm and golden. Emma had never been religious, but her mother had always said that churches were places of sanctuary, and she needed sanctuary now more than anything. The priest who answered her knock was a small man with white hair and kind eyes, but he didn't ask questions when he saw the baby and the desperation in Emma's face. His name was Father Thomas Riley, but he simply said, "Come in, child," and led her to a small office heated by a space heater that rattled but worked. Father Riley brought formula. The church kept emergency supplies for situations exactly like this, but he also brought sandwiches, hot coffee, and a wool blanket. Emma fed Ava first, but watching the baby drink, seeing color return to her tiny cheeks, broke something inside her. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, but now, in the warmth and safety of this small room, the tears came. Father Riley didn't try to stop her, but he sat quietly, occasionally refilling her coffee cup, and when she finally could speak, he listened. Emma told him everything, but not in chronological order. The story came out in fragments and flashbacks. She talked about meeting Tyler at that corporate event, but she also talked about how he'd slowly isolated her from the few friends she'd made in the city. She mentioned how he'd convinced her that her design work was just a hobby and that she should focus on being present for him. But she also remembered moments when he'd seemed genuinely happy, and she couldn't reconcile those memories with the man who'd left her to starve. Father Riley waited until she was finished, but then he said something that would change everything. "Have you checked your mail recently? Physical mail, I mean, not email." Emma shook her head, but the question seemed odd. "The mailbox is in the lobby," she said, "but I haven't been able to get down there in days." "Why?" "Because sometimes," Father Riley said carefully, "important information comes in ways we don't expect, and sometimes the people we trust are the ones who hide it from us." The priest's words planted a seed, but Emma was too exhausted to fully process them. Father Riley offered to let her stay in the church's small emergency shelter, a room with 2 cots usually reserved for homeless individuals during extreme weather. But Emma was grateful beyond words. That night, as Ava slept peacefully for the first time in days, Emma made a decision. She would survive this, but more than that, she would understand why it had happened. The next morning, with Father Riley's help, she accessed the apartment building's lobby. The mailbox was stuffed with letters, but 3 of them were from Rothman, Silverman, and Associates. The return address was embossed in gold, but Emma's hands trembled as she opened the first one. The words swam before her eyes at first, but then they crystallized into sentences that didn't make sense. Trust fund established by Gordon Whitfield, and total estimated value of $1.2 trillion USD across liquid and non-liquid assets, and sole beneficiary as verified through genetic testing coordinated with your mother's medical records. Emma read the letter 3 times, but the words didn't become more real. She opened the second letter, which was dated a week after the first, but its tone was more urgent. The third letter, dated just 4 days ago, indicated that the firm was concerned about the lack of response and was preparing to initiate in-person contact through local authorities if necessary. At the bottom of the third letter was a phone number labeled 24-hour emergency air contact line. Emma borrowed Father Riley's phone, but her fingers shook so badly she had to dial twice. The woman who answered identified herself as Patricia Rothman, senior partner, but her voice was professional, yet warm. "Emma Thorne?" Patricia asked, and Emma could hear the relief in her voice. "We've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks. Can you verify your mother's full maiden name and your date of birth?" Emma provided the information, but she felt like she was moving through a dream. Patricia asked several more verification questions, but each answer seemed to unlock another level of a reality Emma couldn't quite grasp. "Ms. Thorne," Patricia finally said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but it's been verified by 3 independent law firms and 2 international accounting agencies. Your grandfather, Gordon Whitfield, passed away 6 weeks ago, but he left everything to his daughter, Catherine, your mother. Since Catherine predeceased him, you are the sole heir to his estate. This includes controlling interests in 17 Fortune 500 companies, properties across 6 continents, and a portfolio of investments that make you, as of this moment, one of the wealthiest individuals in human history." Emma couldn't speak, but she could hear Ava stirring in the background. "Ms. Thorne," Patricia's voice was gentle, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to come to our office in Manhattan as soon as possible. We have security concerns. People will do terrible things when this much money is involved. Can you get here?" Emma thought about Tyler, but she also thought about the 3 days she'd spent starving. "Yes," she said, "but I need help." Patricia's response was immediate. "A car will be at your location within the hour. Pack nothing. We'll provide everything you need. Just bring your identification and your baby." The next 72 hours moved with surreal speed, but Emma navigated them with a clarity born of survival. Patricia Rothman wasn't just a lawyer, but she was also a woman who'd built her career on protecting vulnerable heirs from predators. She arranged for Emma and Ava to stay in a secure penthouse suite in Manhattan, but she also brought in doctors, nutritionists, and security specialists. The medical team was horrified by Emma's condition, but they treated her with dignity while bringing her body back from the edge of starvation. Ava was examined by a pediatric specialist who confirmed that the baby had been malnourished, but with proper care, she would recover fully. Patricia's team also did something else. They investigated Tyler Bradford with the thoroughness of a military operation. What they uncovered was a pattern of financial fraud, identity theft, and manipulation stretching back a decade. Tyler had targeted women before Emma, but she was the first one who'd ended up pregnant, and that had complicated his usual exit strategy. The intercepted letters were the smoking gun. But Patricia's investigators also discovered that Tyler had been monitoring Emma's email and phone for months. He'd created forwarding rules that sent any communication containing words like inheritance, estate, or trust fund to a hidden folder he controlled remotely. He knew, Patricia said, showing Emma the digital forensics report. Not the full amount, perhaps, but he knew something substantial was coming, and he made a calculated decision to leave you at your most vulnerable, establish separation, but maintain enough documented concern that he could claim abandonment was never his intent. Emma looked at the evidence, but what she felt wasn't anger. Not yet. It was a cold, crystalline understanding of exactly who Tyler had been all along. "What would you like to do?" Patricia asked, but the question was layered with meaning. Emma thought about it for a long moment, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I want him to know, not through lawyers or letters. I want to see his face when he realizes what he lost." Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." The trap was simple but elegant. Patricia's firm leaked information through carefully chosen channels that Emma Thorne had been located and was being represented by Rothman, Silverman and Associates, but the leaked information suggested she was contesting a modest inheritance and needed legal help with a difficult ex-husband. The amounts mentioned in the controlled leak were substantial enough to attract attention, 50 million, maybe 60, but nowhere near the truth. Tyler took the bait in less than 24 hours, but his approach was calculated. He sent flowers to the law office with a card that read, "Emma, I've made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you and Ava. Please let me make this right. T." Patricia forwarded the card to Emma, but she also showed her the private investigator's report on Tyler's activities over the past week. He'd been living in a hotel suite paid for with a cash advance from a high-interest loan, but he'd been researching divorce law and making calls to 3 different attorneys specializing in high-net-worth marital asset recovery. "He still thinks he can manipulate you," Patricia observed. "But more than that, he thinks you're vulnerable enough to fall for it." Emma looked at the flowers. Expensive roses, the kind Tyler had sent her when they first started dating, but she felt nothing except a distant memory of who she'd been before. "Set up a meeting," she said, "but I want you there and I want everything recorded." The meeting was arranged for a conference room in Patricia's office building, but the space had been chosen specifically for its psychological impact. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and original artwork that Patricia casually mentioned had been purchased at auction for barely 8 figures. Tyler arrived wearing a suit Emma had never seen before, but she noticed the way his eyes cataloged everything in the room, calculating, assessing. He'd shaved and gotten a haircut, but there were dark circles under his eyes that even makeup couldn't quite hide. When he saw Emma, his expression transformed into practiced remorse, but she could see the predator beneath the mask now. She'd learned to see it during her 3 days in the snow. "Emma," he said, and his voice broke in exactly the right place. "God, I've been so worried. When I heard you'd been found, that you and Ava were safe, I couldn't believe—" He moved toward her, but Patricia stepped smoothly between them. "Mr. Bradford," Patricia said coolly, "please sit down. Ms. Thorne has agreed to this meeting, but there are ground rules." Tyler's mask slipped for just a moment, but then he recovered and took a seat across from Emma. "Of course. I understand. Emma, I just want to explain. You left us to starve," Emma said, but her voice was calm, factual. "You took everything, but you calculated that I'd be desperate enough to take you back later. You intercepted legal correspondence meant for me because you knew something was coming, but you couldn't control when or how." Tyler's face went pale, but he tried to recover. "I don't know what you've been told, but—" Patricia slid a folder across the table. This is a forensic analysis of your electronic surveillance of Ms. Thorne's accounts, but it also includes a timeline of the intercepted correspondence from our firm. You signed for 3 courier packages using a forged signature, but you were sloppy. The building's security camera caught you. Tyler opened the folder, but Emma watched his hands start to shake. The question, Patricia continued, is what Ms. Thorne wants to do about it. Mail fraud is a federal crime, but forgery and identity theft add additional charges. She could have you arrested right now. There are 2 federal agents waiting outside this office, but she wanted to give you an opportunity to explain yourself first. Tyler looked at Emma, but she saw the moment he decided to try a different tactic. His expression shifted to anger, self-righteousness. You think you're better than me now because you got lucky with some inheritance? You were nothing when I met you, Emma. No family, no prospects, just a lonely girl with a dead-end freelance career. I gave you everything. You gave her isolation and control, Patricia interrupted. But you also gave her a gift, though you didn't mean to. You showed her exactly what you were capable of. Now she gets to decide what comes next. Emma stood, but she moved to the window overlooking the park. The snow had stopped falling, but the landscape was transformed, pristine and white. She thought about the apartment, but she also thought about the moment Ava had finally fallen asleep after 3 days of crying from hunger. I inherited 1.2 trillion, Emma said, but she didn't turn around. Not 50 million, not 60 million, 1.2 trillion with a T. My grandfather was Gordon Whitfield, but you wouldn't know that name because you never actually cared about my family. The lawyers have been trying to reach me for 6 weeks, but you intercepted everything because you thought you could time your return for maximum advantage. Tyler's face had gone from pale to gray, but when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Emma, please. She turned to face him, but her expression was something he'd never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but a cold, absolute understanding. You left your newborn daughter to starve in the snow because you thought it would give you leverage later. You didn't know she'd be inheriting kingdoms. You just knew she'd be inheriting something, but you were willing to let her die for it. I would never, Tyler started, but the words died when he saw Emma's eyes. I want you to know something, Emma said. Every single day for the rest of your life, you're going to remember that you had everything, a wife who loved you, a daughter, a future, and you traded it for what you thought would be a better deal. You're going to read about me in Forbes, but you'll read about Ava too when she's older. You're going to see the life we build, the good we do, but you'll know you could have been part of it if you'd been capable of basic human decency. Tyler's composure finally cracked. He dropped to his knees, but his face was wet with tears that looked real, but might have been calculated even now. Please, Emma, please, I'll do anything. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love Ava. Please. Emma looked at him for a long moment, but then she turned to Patricia. I want full custody, a restraining order, but I also want him prosecuted for the mail fraud and forgery. He doesn't get to walk away this time. Consider it done, Patricia said, but she was already texting the federal agents. Emma picked up her bag, but before she left, she looked at Tyler one last time. You came here begging, but the tragedy is that some part of me actually feels sorry for you. Not because of what you're going to lose. You lost that the moment you walked out the door. But because you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing you're the kind of person who could do this to their own child. That's a prison money can't buy your way out of. She walked out of the conference room, but she didn't look back. In the months that followed, Emma's life transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable during those 3 days in the snow. But she never forgot what that cold felt like. She established a foundation dedicated to supporting abandoned mothers and at-risk infants. But she also funded housing initiatives and food security programs across the country. Ava grew healthy and strong, but Emma made sure her daughter would know the full story someday. Not to teach her to hate her father, but to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that the greatest inheritance wasn't money, but character. Tyler Bradford was convicted of federal mail fraud and served 18 months in a minimum security facility, but his real punishment was exactly what Emma had predicted. He would watch her rise from every prison cell, every parole hearing, every moment of his diminished life, but he would never be part of it. On the day Tyler was released, he received a single letter from Emma, but it wasn't gloating or cruel. It simply said, "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'll ever forget. I hope you find a way to become the person you pretended to be. For your sake, not mine." Tyler kept that letter for the rest of his life, but whether it brought him peace or torment was a question only he could answer. Emma's story became legend in certain circles, the woman who'd been left to die in the snow but rose to become one of the most powerful philanthropists in history. But she never courted publicity. She lived quietly with Ava, but she used her resources to quietly change millions of lives. And on cold winter nights, when the snow fell soft and thick outside her windows, Emma would hold her daughter close and remember that the coldest moments had taught her the warmth of her own strength, but more importantly, they'd taught her that justice, when served cold, could also be merciful. The question wasn't whether Tyler had learned his lesson, but whether the world had learned that underestimating desperate mothers was the greatest mistake any predator could make. The boardroom on the 47th floor of Whitfield Tower overlooked Manhattan in all its glittering complexity, but Ava Thorne stood at the window with her mother's same gray-green eyes, though hers held something different, not the hard-won wisdom of survival, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd been raised to understand that power meant responsibility. She was 20 now, but she carried herself with a grace that made her seem older, wiser. Her speech was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, but Emma watched her daughter from across the room and felt the weight of 2 decades compress into a single moment of profound gratitude. "You ready?" Emma asked, but her voice was soft, maternal despite the corporate setting. Ava turned and smiled, but it was a smile that contained multitudes. "I've been ready my whole life, Mom. You made sure of that." The Whitfield Foundation's annual gala had become one of the most important philanthropic events in the world, but it wasn't the money that made it significant. It was the focus. 20 years ago, Emma had made a promise to herself in a freezing apartment, while her newborn daughter cried from hunger, but that promise had evolved into a mission. No mother would ever face what she'd faced, and no child would ever go hungry because of someone else's cruelty or indifference. The foundation had built housing for 15,000 families, but it had also funded medical clinics, food security programs, and legal aid services for abandoned mothers. The numbers were staggering, over 3 million lives directly impacted, but countless more touched by the ripple effects. Yet Emma had never lost sight of the individual stories behind the statistics. Tonight's gala was special for another reason, but only Emma and a handful of her closest advisors knew why. Patricia Rothman, now 73 but still sharp as a blade, approached with 2 glasses of champagne. She'd become more than Emma's attorney over the years, but rather the godmother Ava had never had and the friend Emma had desperately needed. "He's here," Patricia said quietly, but there was no judgment in her voice, only a question. Emma took the champagne but didn't drink. "Where?" "Back corner table. He looks—" Patricia paused, searching for the right word. "Smaller than I remember." Emma had known Tyler would come. She'd made sure the invitation reached him through channels that couldn't be ignored. But she hadn't told Ava yet. That conversation would come later, but tonight was about something else entirely. The ballroom filled with donors, activists, celebrities who'd made the foundation their pet cause, but also the people who'd actually been helped. Mothers who'd rebuilt their lives, children who'd grown up healthy because someone had cared enough to intervene. Emma had insisted on that mix from the beginning, but it meant her galas felt less like society events and more like family reunions. Father Thomas Riley, now 91 and moving slowly with a cane, made his way to Emma's side. He'd been at every gala, but his presence was more than ceremonial. He'd been the first person to show Emma that kindness still existed in the world, and she'd never forgotten. "You've built something extraordinary," he said, but his eyes were misty. "Your mother would be so proud." "I wish she could have known," Emma said, but the old grief was softer now, wrapped in years of healing. About her father, about all of this. She died thinking she'd been rejected, but Gordon spent his last years trying to find her. "She knows now," Father Riley said with the certainty of faith. "And she's watching over both of you." The lights dimmed, but a spotlight found Ava on the stage. Emma's daughter had studied international relations at Columbia, but she'd also spent her summers working in the foundation's field offices, not as the heiress observing from a distance, but as a volunteer sleeping in the same conditions as everyone else, eating the same food, facing the same challenges. She'd inherited her mother's determination, but she'd been spared the trauma that had forged it. 20 years ago, Ava began, but her voice carried across the silent ballroom. "My mother was left to die in the snow with a 5-week-old baby. She had no food, no heat, no hope, but she had something that couldn't be taken away. The absolute refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Tonight, I want to tell you what she's never told anyone publicly, the full story of those 3 days, but also what came after." Emma felt her breath catch, but she'd approved Ava's speech earlier. They'd worked on it together over months of conversations that had been painful but necessary. The room remained silent as Ava spoke, but Emma could see people leaning forward, captivated. Ava talked about the apartment, but she also talked about Father Riley and St. Michael's Church. She mentioned Patricia Rothman's fierce protection, but she also spoke about the doctors and nutritionists who'd brought her mother back from the edge. She described the foundation's work in concrete terms, the housing units built, the meals served, the legal victories won. But she also shared letters from mothers who'd been saved, children who'd grown up healthy, families that had been kept together when they might have been destroyed. "But here's what my mother taught me," Ava said. But now her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about taking the worst moment of your life and transforming it into someone else's salvation. That's what the Whitfield Foundation has done, but it's also what every single person in this room can do, starting tomorrow." The applause was thunderous, but Emma wasn't watching the crowd. She was watching the back corner table where Tyler Bradford sat alone. He'd aged badly, but that wasn't entirely fair. He'd aged like someone who'd spent 2 decades living with consequences. His hair was gray, but it was the kind of gray that came from stress rather than dignified aging. He'd lost weight, but it made him look gaunt rather than fit. He wore a suit that was nice but not expensive, but Emma could see it had been carefully maintained. Perhaps the same suit he'd worn to other events, where he hoped to recapture some fragment of the life he'd lost. Tyler had been released from prison 18 years ago, but the conviction had destroyed whatever career he'd built on lies. He'd worked a series of mid-level administrative jobs, but nothing that matched his former aspirations. He'd never remarried, but Emma's investigators reported he'd had several relationships that ended badly when the women discovered his past. He lived alone in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens, but he'd stayed out of trouble. Whether from genuine reform or simple exhaustion, Emma couldn't say. She'd invited him for a reason, but it wasn't cruelty. After Ava's speech, after the standing ovation, after the donors had pledged another $340 million to the foundation's work, the exact amount Emma had earned from those 3 desperate freelance jobs, but scaled to meaningful impact, Emma made her way to Tyler's table. He stood when he saw her approaching, but his movement was uncertain and his face showed genuine fear. "Emma," he said, but the word came out hoarse. "I didn't think you'd actually want to see me. I came because the invitation said—" "I know what it said," Emma interrupted gently. "Please, sit." They sat across from each other, but the silence stretched for a long moment. Emma studied the man who'd once controlled her life, but what she felt wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to curiosity, as if she were looking at a stranger who happened to share history with a person she used to be. "Why did you invite me?" Tyler finally asked, but his voice was small, defeated. "Because Ava asked me to," Emma said simply. "She's known about you her whole life. I never lied to her about what happened, but a few months ago she asked if you'd ever tried to reach out, if you'd ever tried to apologize or make amends. I told her you'd sent letters over the years, but I'd never responded." Tyler's hands trembled on the table. "I meant every word of those letters, but I knew I had no right to expect anything from you. I destroyed everything, Emma, I know that. I live with it every single day." "Do you understand why you did it?" Emma asked, but the question was genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "I've spent 20 years trying to understand, but I've never been able to reconcile the person who walked out that door with the person who sent flowers and begged." Tyler was silent for a long time, but when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of hard-won self-knowledge. "I was terrified of being ordinary. My whole life, I'd built this identity around being special, being successful, being the kind of person who deserved extraordinary things, but it was all performance. When I saw that letter about your inheritance, I panicked because I realized you were about to become genuinely extraordinary. But I was still just me, a fraud. So I convinced myself I was making a strategic move, but the truth is I was just running away from my own inadequacy." "And now?" Emma asked. "Now I'm a 54-year-old administrative assistant at a non-profit that helps formerly incarcerated people find housing," Tyler said, but there was no self-pity in his voice. "I make $42,000 a year, but I live simply. I volunteer at a soup kitchen on weekends, but I don't tell people who I am or what I did. I just show up and work. I've been in therapy for 16 years, but I still don't know if I'm capable of real change or if I'm just performing a different role." Emma absorbed this, but she found herself believing him, not because she was naive, but because the years had taught her to recognize genuine humility versus performed remorse. "Ava wants to meet you," she said quietly. "Not because she wants a father, she's never needed one, and frankly, you forfeited that right a long time ago. But because she wants to understand where she came from, but also because she's studying restorative justice and believes people are more than the worst thing they've ever done." Tyler's eyes filled with tears, but he made no move to wipe them away. "I don't deserve that." "No," Emma agreed, "but maybe that's exactly why it matters. Ava didn't grow up with the trauma I survived, but she grew up with the legacy of it, the foundation, the work, the knowledge that her mother was left to die. She could have grown up angry, but instead, she grew up determined to break cycles. Maybe meeting you is part of that." "What do you want from me?" Tyler asked, but the question was desperate, lost. Emma considered this carefully, but when she answered, her voice was firm. "I want you to tell her the truth, not the version that makes you look better, not the strategic omissions, but the actual truth about why you left and what you were thinking. I want you to answer every question she asks, but I also want you to understand that this isn't about redemption. You don't get to walk away from this meeting feeling like you've been forgiven or like you've earned some kind of closure. This is about Ava's healing, not yours. Tyler nodded, but his face showed he understood. When? Tomorrow, if you're willing. Lunch at a restaurant near Columbia. Public, neutral ground. I'll be there, but Patricia will be too, and there will be security. If at any point Ava wants to leave, we leave, but there's no second chance at this conversation. I understand, Tyler said. Emma, I know I have no right to say this, but… Don't, Emma interrupted gently. Whatever you need to say, save it for Ava. She deserves your honesty more than I deserve your apologies. Emma stood to leave, but Tyler spoke one more time. You became everything I pretended to be. That's what hurts most. Not what I lost, but knowing that you were always capable of this, but I was too broken to see it. Emma looked at him for a long moment. The difference between us, Tyler, wasn't capability. It was character. You made choices that prioritized yourself over everyone else, but I made choices that prioritized Ava over everything else. That's not virtue, that's just love. I hope you've learned what that actually means. She walked away, but she felt lighter than she had in years. The next day's lunch was everything Emma had promised. Public, neutral, carefully supervised. Ava arrived first, but her nervousness was evident in the way she kept adjusting her watch, a gesture Emma recognized as her daughter's tell when facing something difficult. Tyler arrived exactly on time, but he looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the meeting had physically compressed him. When Ava saw him, Emma watched her daughter's face cycle through emotions. Curiosity, anger, sadness, determination, before settling into something like scientific observation. They talked for 2 hours, but Emma mostly listened. Ava asked the hard questions. Why did you leave? Did you ever love us? Do you understand what your choices did? But Tyler answered with a rawness that was difficult to witness. He didn't defend himself, but he also didn't wallow in self-pity. He simply told the truth, but the truth was ugly and complicated and human. At one point, Ava asked, "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Tyler thought about this for a long time. Everything, he finally said. But that's too easy an answer. If I'm being completely honest, I would have wanted to be a different person, someone capable of love without calculation, someone who could see you as my daughter instead of a complication to my plans. But I wasn't that person then, but I don't know if I'm that person now either. I hope I am, but hoping isn't the same as knowing. Ava nodded, but Emma could see her daughter processing this with the sharp, analytical mind she'd inherited from Emma, but honed through years of education and experience. I don't forgive you, Ava said finally, but her voice wasn't cruel, it was simply honest. I might someday, but I also might not. But I understand you better now, but that understanding doesn't erase what you did. It just makes it more tragic. I know, Tyler said, and that's more than I deserve. They parted with no promises of future contact, but also without the door completely closed. Emma watched Tyler walk away down Broadway, but she felt Ava take her hand, her daughter's grip strong and sure. How do you feel? Emma asked. Like I just met a character from a story I've always known, Ava said thoughtfully. He's real, but he's also exactly who you told me he was. I'm glad I met him, but I'm also glad I grew up without him. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Emma said, but she pulled her daughter close. That evening, back in the penthouse that had been Emma's home for 20 years, but had never quite stopped feeling like borrowed space, Emma and Ava sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights were beautiful, but Emma found herself thinking about that ground-floor apartment, the frosted windows, the snow falling thick and deadly. Mom, Ava said quietly, do you ever regret not taking him back? Not for romance, but just so I could have had a father. Emma considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. No, she finally said, because taking him back would have taught you that love means accepting cruelty, but raising you without him taught you that love means protecting what matters most. You turned out extraordinary, not despite his absence, but because I refused to let his choices define our future. I'm proud of you, Ava said, but the words held weight. For surviving, yes, but also for building something beautiful from something terrible. That's the real inheritance, Mom. Not the money, but the example. Emma felt tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. You're going to do even more than I did, she said, because you're starting from a place of strength rather than survival. But you also understand what it means to struggle. That combination is powerful. We'll do it together, Ava said. For another 20 years, but hopefully longer. The work isn't done. No, Emma agreed. But tonight, let's just be grateful for how far we've come. They sat in comfortable silence as the city lights blazed below them. But Emma thought about all the mothers and children those lights represented, some thriving, some struggling, some fighting battles no one would ever know about. The foundation would continue its work, but so would she, because the woman who'd been left to starve in the snow had learned that the greatest victory wasn't surviving the cold. It was ensuring others never had to face it alone. 20 years had passed, but the memory of those 3 days remained sharp, precious even, because they'd forged everything that came after. Tyler had taught her what to avoid, but Ava had taught her what to build toward, and in the end, that was the story Emma wanted told. Not the tragedy of betrayal, but the triumph of transformation. The snow would fall again this winter, as it always did, but Emma would watch it from warmth and safety, with her daughter beside her and a legacy stretching out before them like an unwritten promise. And somewhere in Queens, Tyler Bradford would watch the same snowfall and think about the life he'd thrown away. But perhaps, just perhaps, he would also think about the man he might still become. The question wasn't whether he deserved redemption, but whether he was brave enough to pursue it without expectation of reward. That was a question only time could answer, but Emma had learned that some questions were more valuable than their answers. She pulled Ava closer, breathed in the cold air that no longer held any terror, and smiled at the future, uncertain, challenging, but entirely theirs to shape. The inheritance had given them resources, but the struggle had given them purpose. And in the end, purpose was the only currency that truly mattered. The ink on the multi-billion-dollar contract was barely dry when Rebecca Matthews walked through her mansion's front door, unaware she had just signed the most lucrative deal in pharmaceutical history. But her husband Daniel was in their bedroom, tangled in silk sheets with his mistress, planning the exact moment he would kick Rebecca and her 2 children out. The December blizzard howled outside their Connecticut estate as Daniel's cruel smile widened, his fingers interlaced with the woman who had poisoned his mind for months, both of them counting down the hours until Rebecca would be standing in the snow with her confused, shivering kids, while he moved his mistress into the master suite. The contract sat in Rebecca's briefcase, a document that would transfer billions into her name within 72 hours. But Daniel had no idea what he was about to destroy, no concept of the empire his wife had built in secret, no understanding that his betrayal would trigger a cascade of consequences so devastating it would leave him completely paralyzed. How could a man be so blind to his wife's transformation from struggling researcher to pharmaceutical titan? What drives a woman to exact revenge so precisely calculated that her betrayer loses everything, his mobility, his wealth, his freedom, his very identity? And what darkness lurks in the heart of someone who kicks children into a snowstorm, unaware that those same children would witness their mother's metamorphosis into something he could never have imagined? Rebecca Matthews pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner, watching the screen flash green as her digital signature sealed the contract that would change everything. But she had no idea that in exactly 47 minutes her husband would shatter her world into pieces so small she'd spend the next 3 months gathering them from the snow. The fluorescent lights in the Manhattan conference room hummed above her as 6 attorneys in charcoal suits nodded their approval, their faces betraying nothing of the seismic shift this document represented for the pharmaceutical industry. "Congratulations, Dr. Matthews," the lead attorney said, sliding the leather portfolio across the mahogany table. "Vitagen Solutions is now yours. The transfer of funds will complete within 72 hours. Rebecca's fingers trembled as she closed the portfolio, but not from excitement, from the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent 7 years developing a revolutionary gene therapy while raising 2 children and maintaining a marriage that had been dying in slow motion. The contract represented the acquisition of Vitagen Solutions, a biotechnology company she'd built from nothing in a lab no bigger than her kitchen, working through nights when her husband Daniel slept soundly, when her children Lily and Marcus were tucked into their beds, when the world believed she was just another suburban mother with modest ambitions. The numbers swam before her eyes. $4.7 billion in an initial payment, but her mind couldn't fully grasp the magnitude, couldn't reconcile this moment with the woman she'd been 7 years ago, scraping together grant money, mixing compounds in borrowed laboratory space, driven by a singular vision to cure the degenerative disease that had killed her father. She remembered his final months, how the illness had slowly stolen his ability to walk, then to feed himself, then to speak, until all that remained was his eyes, still bright with love but trapped in a body that had become his prison. Rebecca gathered her belongings, her phone buzzing with a text from Daniel. "Working late again? Don't bother coming home for dinner." The message sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the December weather, but she dismissed it as paranoia, the natural anxiety of someone carrying a secret too large to share until everything was finalized. She had planned to tell Daniel tonight, to share this triumph with the man she'd married 12 years ago, the man who had promised to support her dreams even when they seemed impossible. The elevator descended 43 floors as Rebecca rehearsed her revelation, but with each passing floor a sense of dread grew in her stomach, an instinct she couldn't name, whispering that something fundamental had shifted in her absence. She had been in Manhattan for 6 hours, finalizing the deal that would secure her family's future for generations, unaware that her husband had spent those same 6 hours planning her destruction. The drive from Manhattan to their Connecticut estate normally took 90 minutes, but tonight, with the blizzard intensifying, it stretched to nearly 3 hours. Rebecca's Mercedes navigated the increasingly treacherous roads as snow accumulated on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. She thought about Lily, 9 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn determination, and Marcus, 7, who had inherited Rebecca's analytical mind and his father's athletic grace. Her children had no idea their mother had just become one of the wealthiest women in America. But they also had no idea their father had been conducting an affair for 8 months with Victoria Ashford, a 28-year-old marketing executive who had convinced Daniel that Rebecca's dedication to her research was really neglect, that her late nights in the lab revealed a woman who valued science over family, that he deserved someone who would prioritize his needs above everything else. Rebecca pulled into the circular driveway at 9:47 p.m., noting that every light in the house blazed despite her repeated requests to conserve energy. But she attributed it to Daniel's carelessness, not to the fact that he and Victoria had been celebrating their plan to evict Rebecca, drinking champagne in the bedroom Rebecca had decorated with such care, mocking the woman who had no idea her life was about to implode. The front door was unlocked, but when Rebecca stepped inside, calling out for her children, she was met with silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Her briefcase slipped from her fingers, landing on the marble floor with a crack that echoed through the empty foyer. "Daniel," she called out, her voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "Lily, Marcus." Footsteps descended the grand staircase, but they weren't her husband's familiar stride. Instead, a woman Rebecca had never seen before appeared, wearing nothing but one of Daniel's Oxford shirts, her blonde hair tousled, her smile radiating contempt. "You must be Rebecca," Victoria said, descending the stairs with the confidence of someone who already considered this house her own. "Daniel's been expecting you." Rebecca's world tilted as understanding crashed through her, but before she could speak, Daniel emerged from the master bedroom, fully dressed, his expression cold and distant in a way she'd never witnessed in 12 years of marriage. "Rebecca," he said, his voice flat, emotionless, "we need to talk." "Who is this?" Rebecca demanded, her scientific mind struggling to process the evidence before her. But she already knew, some primal part of her recognizing the predatory way this woman looked at her husband, the possessive way Daniel's hand briefly touched Victoria's lower back as he passed her on the stairs. "This is Victoria," Daniel said, each word precisely enunciated, as if he'd rehearsed this speech. "And she's moving in. Tonight." The words hung in the air like ice crystals, but Rebecca's brain refused to accept their meaning, kept searching for the joke, the misunderstanding, the rational explanation for why her husband was standing in their foyer with another woman wearing his clothes. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "Daniel, what are you? Where are the children?" "They're in the guest house with my mother," Daniel replied, his eyes fixed somewhere over Rebecca's shoulder, unable to meet her gaze. "You need to pack your things and leave. Tonight." The temperature in the house suddenly felt arctic, but it was nothing compared to the cold spreading through Rebecca's chest, freezing her lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. "Leave?" Rebecca repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "This is my house, our house. We have children, Daniel. We have a life." "Had a life," Victoria interrupted, her voice honey-sweet but edged with venom. "Past tense. Daniel's been miserable for years, trapped in a marriage with a woman who cares more about her little lab experiments than her own family." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to focus on Daniel, to appeal to the man she'd married, the man who had held her hand in the delivery room when Lily was born, who had danced with her at their 10th anniversary party. "Daniel, please," Rebecca said, stepping toward him. "Whatever this is, we can work through it. We have children. We have history. I know I've been distracted with work, but nothing," Daniel cut her off, his voice rising. "I'm done, Rebecca. Done pretending I'm happy. Done living in the shadow of your obsession with dead cells and test tubes. Done explaining to our friends why my wife can't attend social events, because she's too busy playing scientist." Each word was a blade, but Rebecca heard something beneath the anger, something coached and artificial, as if Daniel were reading from a script Victoria had written. "When did this start?" Rebecca asked, her scientific mind seeking data, timelines, evidence. "Does it matter?" Victoria answered for him, moving to stand beside Daniel, her hand sliding possessively around his waist. "It started because you failed as a wife, because you made Daniel feel invisible, because you chose your career over your marriage." Rebecca's laugh erupted involuntarily, bitter and sharp, but it was tinged with genuine disbelief at the audacity of this stranger critiquing a marriage she knew nothing about. "You don't know anything about my marriage," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And you," she turned to Daniel, "you're really going to do this, Throw away 12 years because of her. I'm doing this because I deserve to be happy, Daniel said, and for the first time his voice carried conviction. I deserve someone who puts me first, someone who doesn't disappear into a lab for days at a time, someone who remembers she has a husband. I was working, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. I was working to secure our future. By abandoning your present, Victoria interrupted again, clearly relishing her role in this destruction. Daniel told me how you missed Lily's dance recital, Marcus's championship game, your own anniversary dinner. The accusations hit their marks, but each one was a memory twisted, context stripped away. Rebecca had missed Lily's recital because she was presenting her research to the FDA. She'd missed Marcus's game because she was negotiating with investors who would only meet on that specific day. She'd missed their anniversary because Daniel had scheduled it on the same night as her critical patent hearing without asking her first. You can't just kick me out, Rebecca said, fighting to maintain composure. This is my house, too. Legally. Actually, Daniel pulled a folded document from his pocket, his expression smug. I can. This house is in my name only. My inheritance from my father bought it. You have no legal claim. The revelation struck like a physical blow, but Rebecca's mind immediately began cataloging facts, searching her memory of the purchase. 9 years ago, she'd been pregnant with Marcus, overwhelmed with morning sickness and research deadlines. Daniel had handled all the paperwork, assured her the house was their shared asset, their family home. You're lying, Rebecca said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Check the deed, Daniel said, tossing the document at her feet. It's all there. This house belongs to me, and I want you gone. Rebecca bent to retrieve the paper, her hands shaking as she scanned the legal text. But there it was, in official stamps and signatures. The house was solely in Daniel's name. She'd been so trusting, so focused on her research, that she'd never verified what he'd told her. Fine, Rebecca said, straightening her spine, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. I'll leave, but I'm taking my children. No, Daniel said simply. You're not. The world stopped, but in that suspended moment Rebecca saw with crystalline clarity the full extent of Daniel's betrayal, the calculated cruelty of a man who had planned every detail. What did you say? Rebecca whispered. The children stay with me, Daniel repeated. You can see them on weekends, supervised visits. My lawyer has already filed for full custody. On what grounds? Rebecca demanded, her voice rising to a shout. I'm their mother. On the grounds that you're never home, Victoria said, her smile widening. On the grounds that you prioritize your work over your children. Daniel has documented every missed event, every late night, every time you chose your lab over your family. Any judge will see you're an unfit mother. The room spun as Rebecca processed the enormity of the trap, but her scientist's mind began assembling counter-evidence, preparing her defense, calculating odds and strategies. I'm not leaving without Lily and Marcus, Rebecca said, her voice iron. Then I'll call the police, Daniel said, pulling out his phone, and have you removed for trespassing. Trespassing, Rebecca's voice cracked. I live here. Not anymore, Daniel said, his finger hovering over the screen. You have 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave. If you're still here after that, I'm calling the cops. And I promise you, Rebecca, if you make a scene, if you upset the children, I'll use it in court. I'll show the judge how unstable you are, how you can't control your emotions, how you're a danger to their well-being. The threat was clear, but what paralyzed Rebecca wasn't the legal implications. It was the realization that Daniel had become a stranger, someone capable of weaponizing her love for their children against her. I need to see them, Rebecca said, tears finally breaking through her composure. I need to tell them. No, Daniel cut her off. They're sleeping. My mother gave them dinner and put them to bed. You'll only confuse them. I'll explain everything tomorrow when you're gone." "Daniel, please," Rebecca begged, abandoning pride, willing to prostrate herself if it meant staying connected to her children. "Don't do this. Whatever I've done wrong, I can fix it. I can work less. I can be more present. Just don't take my children from me." "It's too late," Daniel said, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. But it wasn't remorse or compassion. It was satisfaction, the pleasure of a man finally wielding power over someone he'd resented for years. Victoria moved closer to Daniel, her hand sliding into his, but her eyes stayed locked on Rebecca, drinking in every moment of her devastation like fine wine. "The clock's ticking," Victoria said. 28 minutes now. Better get packing." Rebecca wanted to fight, to scream, to tear down the house she'd thought was her home, but some survival instinct whispered that Daniel was serious, that he would call the police, that any display of emotion would be used against her in the custody battle to come. She had to retreat, regroup, prepare her counterattack with the same methodical precision she applied to her research. "I need more than 30 minutes, Rebecca said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I need to gather important documents, my research." "You have 30 minutes, Daniel repeated, "or you leave with nothing." Rebecca climbed the stairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body, but her mind was already racing, cataloging what she needed, what she couldn't leave behind. She passed the children's rooms, pausing at each door, pressing her hand against the wood as if she could transmit her love through the solid barrier. In the master bedroom she'd shared with Daniel for 9 years, Rebecca found her research materials had already been boxed up, but as she opened each container, she realized critical documents were missing, her most sensitive research notes nowhere to be found. Daniel had been planning this for weeks, possibly months, stealing her work while pretending everything was normal. She packed a suitcase with mechanical efficiency, but her hands kept reaching for items that represented her life here. The photo of Lily's first day of school, Marcus's drawings magneted to the refrigerator, the anniversary cards Daniel had written when he still loved her. Each item was a memory, a moment of happiness now poisoned by betrayal. 29 minutes later, Rebecca descended the stairs with a single suitcase and her briefcase. But she'd left behind a dozen boxes of research, her children's artwork, the accumulated treasures of a life she'd thought was permanent. Daniel stood by the door, Victoria draped over him like a possession, but when Rebecca passed, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "One more thing," Daniel said, his voice low. "Don't try to contact the children. Don't show up at their school. Don't call the house. Any violation of these rules, and I'll get a restraining order. Understand?" Rebecca jerked her arm free, but she nodded, unable to trust her voice, unable to look at this man without seeing a monster where her husband used to be. "Good," Daniel said, opening the front door. "Have a nice life, Rebecca." The blizzard hit her like a wall of ice, but it was nothing compared to the cold of Daniel's dismissal. Rebecca stepped into the snow, her suitcase wheels immediately bogging down in the accumulation. The driveway stretched before her, her Mercedes barely visible through the whiteout conditions. Behind her, the door slammed shut, but she heard the distinct click of the locks engaging, the sound of her family sealing her out. She turned back once, seeing Daniel and Victoria silhouetted in the window, watching her struggle through the storm like spectators at an execution. Rebecca's tears froze on her cheeks, but she forced herself forward, dragging her suitcase through snow that reached her calves, her expensive heels offering no traction, her coat insufficient for the brutal weather. She'd been kicked out into a blizzard, sent away like garbage, separated from her children who would wake tomorrow wondering where their mother had gone. The Mercedes refused to start at first, but after 3 attempts the engine turned over, the dashboard lights illuminating her tear-stained face. She sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, body shaking with cold and shock and rage, so profound it felt like a living thing inside her chest. But as she sat there, something shifted. But it wasn't defeat, it was clarity, the same cold precision that had allowed her to solve problems that had stumped researchers for decades. Daniel thought he'd destroyed her, thought he'd taken everything that mattered, thought he'd reduced her to a broken woman with nothing left to lose. He had no idea about the contract in her briefcase, but more importantly, he had no idea what he'd awakened in her. Rebecca Matthews, the woman who had dedicated her life to curing degenerative diseases, who had fought through skepticism and sexism and countless failures, who had built an empire in secret while her husband slept, was not going to disappear into the snow and surrender. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found her attorney's number. But she didn't call him yet. Not until she'd formulated a plan. Not until she'd transformed her rage into strategy. The blizzard continued to rage around her car, but inside, Rebecca's mind had never been clearer. Daniel had made 3 critical mistakes, but he wouldn't realize them until it was far too late to save himself. First, he'd underestimated her, assumed that because she'd been a devoted wife and mother, she would crumble under his cruelty. Second, he'd kicked her out before the contract completed, before he had any legal claim to her fortune. Third, he'd revealed his true nature so completely that any judge would see through his manufactured custody case. Rebecca started recording a voice memo, but her voice was steady now, clinical, detailing everything that had just happened with the precision of someone documenting a scientific experiment. She described Victoria's presence, Daniel's threats, the missing research documents, the calculated timing of his betrayal. This recording would be the foundation of her legal defense. She drove away from the estate slowly, carefully, navigating the treacherous roads, but in her rear-view mirror, she watched the house disappear into the snow, and with it, the last remnants of the woman she'd been. That woman was dead, killed by a husband's betrayal and left in a snowdrift. Someone new was being born, someone Daniel Matthews would come to fear. Rebecca checked into a hotel 30 miles away, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she spread her contract across the desk, studying every clause, every provision, every advantage it gave her. The money would arrive in 72 hours, but she needed to move faster than that. At 3:47 a.m., she finally called her attorney, but she also called 3 private investigators, 2 of the most ruthless divorce lawyers in Connecticut, and a child psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. By dawn, she'd set in motion a cascade of actions that would dismantle Daniel's life piece by piece. The private investigators delivered their first report within 48 hours, but it was better than Rebecca could have imagined. Victoria Ashford had a history, a pattern of targeting wealthy married men, engineering divorces, and extracting settlements before moving to her next victim. She'd done it twice before, and Daniel was simply her latest mark. More importantly, the investigators discovered that Victoria had been stealing from Daniel's company, but in small enough amounts that he hadn't noticed, siphoning money from accounts he rarely checked. She'd been planning to disappear with a substantial nest egg once Daniel's divorce was finalized, leaving him with nothing but debt and humiliation. Rebecca might have warned him, but the man who had kicked her out into a blizzard didn't deserve her protection. Instead, she cataloged the evidence, building a file that would destroy Victoria's credibility in any courtroom while simultaneously demonstrating Daniel's staggering negligence and poor judgment. The money transferred on schedule, but Rebecca didn't celebrate. She used the first $1 million to retain the best legal team in the state, lawyers who made Daniel's attorney look like a first-year law student. She used another $1 million to secure temporary custody rights, filing an emergency motion that forced Daniel to allow supervised visits with the children. When she finally saw Lily and Marcus again, in a sterile conference room with a court-appointed supervisor watching, but their tears nearly broke her resolve. They didn't understand why Mommy had left, why Daddy's new friend was sleeping in Mommy's bed, why everything had changed so suddenly. "I didn't leave you," Rebecca told them, holding both children close. "I would never leave you. Daddy asked me to go away for a little while, but I'm fighting to come home. Do you understand? Mommy is fighting to be with you." "Why did Daddy's friend say you didn't want us anymore?" Lily asked, her voice small and confused. Rebecca's rage crystallized into diamond-hard certainty, but she kept her voice gentle for her children. "That's not true, baby. That woman lied. I want you more than anything in the world, and I'm going to prove it." The court battle began in earnest, but Rebecca approached it like she approached her research, methodically, thoroughly, leaving nothing to chance. Her lawyers painted a picture of Daniel's cruelty, his calculated betrayal, his willingness to traumatize his children for his own selfish desires. They presented evidence of Rebecca's professional success, but carefully, demonstrating that her work had been providing for the family's future, not neglecting them. They brought in colleagues who testified to her dedication, teachers who confirmed she'd never missed a parent-teacher conference, coaches who remembered her at every game, despite Daniel's false timeline. Daniel's case collapsed within weeks, but Rebecca wasn't satisfied with merely winning custody. She wanted him to understand what he'd destroyed, wanted him to feel the same devastation he'd inflicted on her. Her opportunity came when Victoria's theft was exposed, but it was worse than the initial investigation had revealed. She'd stolen nearly $800,000 from Daniel's investment firm, forged his signature on documents, created false accounts in his name. When the FBI began investigating, Victoria disappeared, leaving Daniel to face fraud charges alone. His company imploded, but Rebecca made sure to buy up the debt, to become his primary creditor, to control his financial future. Within 3 months of kicking her out, Daniel had lost his business, his reputation, and was facing potential prison time. The custody hearing was almost anticlimactic, but the judge's decision was unequivocal. Full custody to Rebecca, supervised visits only for Daniel until he completed therapy and demonstrated stability. The judge's words were scathing, condemning Daniel's reprehensible cruelty and staggering lack of judgment. But Rebecca wasn't done. But her final move required patience, required waiting for exactly the right moment. That moment came 6 months after the divorce was finalized, when Daniel's legal troubles had consumed his savings, when he'd been forced to sell the mansion, when he was living in a modest apartment and working a job that barely covered his expenses. She arranged a meeting, but on her terms, in her office, in the building that housed Vitagen Solutions headquarters, a structure she'd purchased with a fraction of her wealth. Daniel arrived looking haggard, desperate, probably hoping she'd offer some mercy, some relief from the consequences of his actions. "Thank you for coming," Rebecca said, her voice professional, detached. "I wanted you to see what you threw away." She showed him the contract, but more than that, she explained exactly how wealthy she'd become, how the deal he'd known nothing about had transformed her into a billionaire. She described the empire she'd built while he slept, the revolutionary treatment that would save millions of lives, the legacy she'd create. "You kicked me out thinking I was nothing," Rebecca said, watching his face drain of color. "Thinking I was just a failed scientist playing in a lab. You had no idea what I'd become, what I was capable of, and now it's too late." Daniel tried to speak, but Rebecca held up her hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to gloat," she continued. "I'm here to give you a gift, a taste of what you destroyed." She pulled out a document, but it wasn't a check or an offer of reconciliation. It was a report from her research team, describing a new treatment they'd developed for stress-induced neurological conditions. "This is cutting-edge gene therapy," Rebecca explained. "It can reverse certain types of paralysis caused by psychological trauma. We've been testing it for FDA approval." "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you're going to need it," Rebecca said simply. She gestured to her security team, but they didn't move toward Daniel. Instead, they simply stood there, witnesses to what would come next. "You see," Rebecca continued, I've spent the last 6 months not just winning in court, but understanding you. Understanding what makes you tick, what you value, what you fear. And I've realized something important. You're a coward, Daniel. You've always been a coward." "Rebecca, please," Daniel started, but she cut him off. "The stress of your legal troubles, the investigation, the loss of everything you thought made you important. It's been eating you alive," Rebecca said, her voice clinical. "Your blood pressure has been dangerously high. You've been having episodes of numbness in your extremities. You've ignored these symptoms because you're too proud to see a doctor, too afraid of what they might find." Daniel's face went pale, but Rebecca could see he recognized the truth in her words. "What you don't know is that I've been monitoring your medical records," Rebecca continued, "legally through proper channels as part of the custody evaluation. And what I found is alarming. You're developing a stress-induced neurological condition. If left untreated, it will progress to complete paralysis within 6 to 8 months. The room seemed to freeze, but Rebecca's expression remained neutral, scientific, as if discussing data from an experiment. "You're lying," Daniel whispered, but his voice trembled with fear. "I'm a scientist," Rebecca replied. "I don't lie about medical data. Here's your file. Read it yourself." She slid a folder across her desk, but Daniel's hand shook so violently he could barely open it. Inside were test results, scans, doctor's notes from a physician who had examined him during the custody proceedings. "This can't be happening," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "There has to be treatment." "There is," Rebecca said softly. "The therapy I just described. We're still in trials, but preliminary results are promising. 93% reversal of paralysis symptoms in early-stage patients." Hope flickered across Daniel's face, but Rebecca's next words extinguished it like water on flame. "But there's a problem," she continued. "The treatment costs approximately $2.3 million per patient, and it's not covered by insurance. It's experimental, you see, only available to those who can afford it." Daniel's face crumpled, but Rebecca felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Only the cold certainty that justice was being served. "I don't have that kind of money," Daniel whispered. "You know I don't." "Rebecca, please, if there's any mercy in you." "Mercy?" Rebecca's voice was ice. "Did you show me mercy when you kicked me out into a blizzard? Did you show our children mercy when you tried to take their mother away? Did you show mercy when you stole my research, when you lied to judges, when you let that woman poison everything we'd built?" "I'm sorry," Daniel sobbed, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was stupid. Please, Rebecca, please don't let me end up paralyzed. I'll do anything." "Anything?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward. "Would you give up your parental rights? Would you sign over any future claims to my wealth? Would you publicly admit what you did? Acknowledge your cruelty, accept full responsibility?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "Yes, anything. Just help me." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, but she'd already made her decision, had made it months ago when she first conceived this plan. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the air like an execution, but Rebecca continued, her voice never wavering. "You see, Daniel, I am going to help you. Not because you deserve it, but because I'm not the monster you tried to make me into. I'm going to provide you with the treatment completely free of charge." Confusion washed over Daniel's face, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "there are conditions. You will sign over all parental rights to our children. You will never contact them again unless they initiate it as adults. You will publicly acknowledge your fraud, your affair, your cruelty. You will spend the rest of your life knowing that the only reason you can still walk is because the woman you betrayed is a better person than you could ever be." "And if I refuse?" Daniel asked, though they both knew he wouldn't. "Then you'll be paralyzed within 8 months," Rebecca said flatly, "and I'll still have my children, my wealth, my success. But you'll have nothing except a body that won't obey you, trapped in the prison of consequences you built for yourself." It wasn't really a choice, but Rebecca had structured it to feel like one, had engineered this moment with the same precision she applied to molecular biology. Daniel would agree because he was a coward, because he'd always prioritized his own comfort over everything else, because even now, faced with losing his children forever, he'd choose himself. "I'll sign," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'll sign whatever you want." Rebecca slid the documents across her desk, but as Daniel reached for them, his hand suddenly spasmed, fingers curling involuntarily. He gasped, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "It's starting," Rebecca said quietly. "The preliminary symptoms. You have maybe 3 months before it becomes permanent. Sign now and we begin treatment tomorrow." Daniel signed with his left hand, his right still trembling uncontrollably, but each signature was an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that Rebecca had won completely and utterly. When he finished, Rebecca took the documents back, but she made no move to provide the promised treatment information. "Rebecca?" Daniel asked, fear creeping back into his voice. "The treatment will begin tomorrow, as promised," Rebecca said, standing. "But Daniel, there's one more thing you should know." She walked to the window, looking out over the city, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute victory. "The neurological condition, the paralysis, it's entirely psychological." Daniel's face went white, but Rebecca continued, driving the knife deeper. "There's nothing physically wrong with you. The tremors, the numbness, the test results, all manufactured, all part of the custody evaluation to demonstrate your psychological instability. The treatment I described, it's just intensive therapy for psychosomatic conditions." "You mean?" Daniel couldn't finish the sentence. "I mean you were never in danger of physical paralysis," Rebecca said, turning to face him. "But you are now. The mind is a powerful thing, Daniel. You believed so completely that you were dying, that your body was failing, that by the time you realize it was all psychological, the damage will be real. That's what happens when stress and belief combine. They create their own reality." Daniel tried to stand, but his legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor. Rebecca's security team moved forward, but she waved them back. "You did this," Rebecca said, looking down at him. "Every bit of this. You created this situation when you chose cruelty over compassion, when you kicked your wife out into the snow, when you tried to weaponize your children against their mother. What I've done is simply show you the consequences of your actions." "Help me," Daniel begged from the floor, his body now fully trembling. "Rebecca, please." "I am helping you," Rebecca said coldly. "You'll receive the therapy you need. Real therapy to address the psychological damage you've done to yourself. Whether you ever walk again depends entirely on whether you can face what you've become, acknowledge what you've done, and find some way to live with it." She nodded to her security team, but they lifted Daniel gently, professionally, carrying him toward the door. "One more thing," Rebecca called after him. "Your apartment, your car, your few remaining assets. I own them all. You're living on my mercy now, surviving because I choose to allow it. Remember that every morning when you wake up, Remember that the woman you tried to destroy is the only reason you have anything left. The door closed behind him, but Rebecca remained at the window, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness where her love for Daniel used to live. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "Mom, can we have pancakes tomorrow for breakfast?" Rebecca smiled for the first time in months, but it was genuine, warm, untainted by the darkness of revenge. "Of course, baby," she replied. "Chocolate chip pancakes, your favorite." She gathered her things, preparing to leave the office, but paused at a framed photo on her desk. Her father, in his final days, eyes still bright despite his body's failure. He'd spent his last breath telling her to use her gifts to help people, to make the world better, to never let cruelty win. Rebecca had done that, but she'd also learned that sometimes help looked like harsh truth. Sometimes making the world better meant ensuring cruel men faced consequences, and sometimes preventing cruelty from winning required strategic ruthlessness. Daniel would recover or he wouldn't, but either way, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he'd destroyed his own family for nothing, thrown away a fortune he never knew existed, and transformed the woman who loved him into the architect of his downfall. That knowledge would be its own paralysis, far more permanent than any physical condition. Rebecca left her office, stepping into the December night, but this time she had a warm car waiting, a beautiful home to return to, and her children safe in their beds. The snow fell softly around her, but it no longer felt threatening. It was just weather, just one more obstacle to navigate, just another challenge she would overcome through patience, intelligence, and strategic planning. Behind her, in the building she owned, in an office that represented her triumph, Daniel Matthews remained. But he was already a memory, already irrelevant, already paralyzed by the consequences of his own cruelty, whether his body eventually reflected it or not. And Rebecca Matthews, the woman who had been kicked out into a blizzard with nothing but a briefcase containing the future, drove home through the snow to make chocolate chip pancakes for her children, unaware that her story would become legend, a cautionary tale about underestimating quiet women who work while cruel men sleep, and a reminder that the worst paralysis isn't physical. It's the moment you realize you've destroyed everything that mattered and there's no going back.